Okay, well, welcome everyone to the first CTNS event of the 2021-22 academic year. I'm Bob Russell, the E.N.G. Barber Professor of Theology and Science here at the GTU, the Graduate Theological Union, and the founder and director of the Center for Theology and Natural Sciences. I'm delighted that you're joining us by Zoom today for our annual Russell Family Fellowship in Religion and Science Conference. So this is a momentous year for us at CTNS. It's our 40th anniversary. It began in 1981. For those of you who remember back that far. And I was the founding director and assistant professor of theology and science then. For 35 years, CTNS was a separately incorporated organization affiliated with the GTU. In 2016, so 5 years ago, we became an internal program of the GTU. And this is giving us a lasting institutional and programmatic foundation. The mission of CTNS is to support and sponsor the creative mutual interaction. So it's creative, mutual, and interaction. Mutual is a key word there, between theology and science. And our program areas include research, teaching, and public service. The Russell Family Fellowship program really spans all three of those programs. Today is the research arm. Last Wednesday was the public arm, and Kirk's work is being used currently in my courses, so he's present at least through his books, which is great, and they're fantastic. And today, Kirk will speak on engaging hypotheticals in his fellowship lecture. So the agenda will be to start with Kirk's lecture, followed by 3 short responses, and a brief time for Q&A from you, the webinar audience. We'll close sharply at 3. So Kirk Vector McNally is the Donna and Marshall Robinson Assistant Professor of Science, Philosophy, and Religion at Union College, which is located in Schenectady, New York. He is a G2 graduate, graduating in 2003, did his PhD with Ted Peters and me in theology and science. His work now focuses primarily on the implications of contemporary physics for our understanding of humanity, the cosmos, and God. He is the author of The Entangled God, Divine Relationality in Quantum Physics, published by Routledge in 2011. And that is very much a development directly out of his doctoral dissertation. And I think it's a fantastic book, one of the best in the field, and I recommend it to you. So get The Entangled God. And he's co-editor, of 2 volumes, Quantum Mechanics, Scientific Perspectives on Divine Action, which was the 5th in the Vatican Observatory CTNS series of conferences and publications. And that was in 2002, before he graduated. And Science and Spiritual Quest, new essays by leading scientists, again in 2002. And that was taken from our major international program called Science and Spiritual Quest. It is a true pleasure having Kirk as our 40th Russell Family Fellow. It's amazing, Kirk, 40 of them. Thank you for accepting this invitation. I'm grateful for our lasting friendship. Kirk, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. As am I. Grateful for everything that we've done together and what you've, the road that you've set me on and in my own career. And it's an honor to be here today to give the Russell Family Research Fellowship Lecture. So I would like to talk today about what may seem like an odd combination of ideas and contexts, but it's motivated by, first, my training in theology and science, and second, by the fact that I find myself now teaching at a secular institution in the Northeast and teaching not really theology, but teaching religious studies. And so I've been thinking a lot about what it means to teach, for me to teach at a secular institution. And so this paper is in some ways a first attempt to try to articulate a way in which I think it might be helpful for students in my religious studies classes to engage in some theological reflection. So, engaging hypotheticals. When secular anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, and historians study and teach students about religious ideas, which of course they can and should do, disciplinary norms obligate them to put a certain amount of existential distance between themselves and their subject matter. When it comes to understanding how and why people believe certain religious ideas, secular scholars are obligated to avoid introducing undue personal bias into their analysis. In effect, they must agree to police themselves and be policed by others to ensure that their own views regarding the truth of a given set of religious ideas does not interfere or govern or interfere with their articulation or analysis of those ideas. Scholarly integrity, it's widely understood, requires secular scholars of religion to set aside, bracket or suspend, epoche in the Greek, to suspend their own judgment regarding the truth of the ideas they study and teach. So the secular scholar of religion, qua scholar, is concerned not with the truth of the religious ideas in and of themselves, but with the anthropological, sociological, and historical truth of why and how others outside the academy choose to believe them or not. Now, the theologian's situation in this regard is quite different. For theologians, the other is the self, and the bracketed question is the primary question. Is reality, for example, fundamentally loving, indifferent, physical, conflictual, spiritual, empty? And is human cruelty the result of sin, ignorance, brokenness, genetics? The answers to such questions matter personally to theologians because they are expected, according to the norms of their own discipline, to care personally about whether any of the answers being offered are true in and of themselves. Theological analysis is unavoidably shaped by personal judgment, identity, and background, because unlike in the case of secular forms of scholarly analysis of religion, it's generally understood that the truth of religious ideas bears directly on the theologian's own well-being and even ultimate destiny. Theologians care about whether religious ideas are true because, existentially speaking, they have a horse in the race. They scrutinize religious ideas not only with the understanding that those ideas are believed by someone somewhere out there, but with the expectation that they are personally relevant, viable truth candidates to be evaluated with corresponding existential seriousness. For those who attend or teach at religiously affiliated colleges, universities, or seminaries, any number of reasons for studying religious ideas theologically, which is to say, from the perspective of caring personally about the truth of the ideas themselves, any number of reasons for studying religious ideas theologically might come to mind. To understand more deeply the basic coherence or implications of one's own religious tradition and beliefs, to become a faithful leader within one's religious community, to defend the truth of one's own religious tradition against its critics, or to reformulate a system of belief associated with one's own religious tradition in light of challenges posed by some contemporary context. In each of these cases, the existential motivation is clear. People study religious ideas theologically out of a desire to find answers to questions that matter to them personally, because those questions have arisen in the context of their own religious beliefs and practices. But what about those of us or those of our students with equally existential questions of their own, but who do not identify as personally religious, or who study and teach at self-avowedly non-confessional secular institutions of higher education, where a confessional posture is antithetical to the ethos of the classroom, strictly so for the teacher, but to a certain degree for the student as well. In the secular religious studies classroom, after all, it is considered extremely bad pedagogical form to attempt to indoctrinate, and similarly bad pupillary form to deny or belittle the religious views of others. So is there any sense in which a theological approach to the study of religious ideas might be possible for us? Could such an approach be seen as valuable, as a helpful perspective to include in the secular classroom? Could caring about the truth of religious ideas serve as a common ground for discussing and evaluating them? And if so, what kinds of rules would need to be in place for secular institutions like the one I teach at to regard this not only as possible, but even as desirable? In this paper, I will argue that explicitly theological engagement with religious ideas in the secular classroom is both possible and worthwhile. This argument could be extended to theological scholarship as well, but here I will focus exclusively on the classroom. And to make my case, I begin with some brief reflections on the secular and theological study of religion in higher education. I then consider recent debates among theologians and philosophers over whether and what type of naturalism is entailed by a basic commitment to the practices of science. I will propose a variant of naturalism I call epistemic naturalism, which I contend functions as an effective starting point for secular theological engagement with religious ideas. I argue that from the perspective of epistemic naturalism, religious ideas can be understood and treated as hypotheses to be tested to whatever extent possible, and then adopted or rejected based on their plausibility and their potential contribution to one's overall worldview. Of course, what I present here can only be a sketch of what I imagine becoming a significantly larger project. My aim today is a modest one, not to convince you to sign on the dotted line, but instead to convince you that the basic scheme I'm proposing is a plausible, valuable hypothesis in itself, worthy of our consideration. So the first section, the secular and theological study of religion. The secular academic study of religion, captured in the term religious studies, dominates much of the English-speaking world of higher education today. One obvious example of its dominance is the vast number of colleges and universities that were initially founded by religious figures and denominations in the 18th and 19th centuries, but which over the past half century have replaced or at least supplemented their confessional course offerings in theology with non-confessional courses in religious studies. Much has been gained as a result of this move toward a more multi-religious point of view in the teaching and study of religion. Undergraduates who venture into the world of religious studies today are much better versed in the world's great variety of religious traditions and ideas than were their counterparts of previous centuries. They are encouraged to learn more about their own traditions, if they actively identify with one, and many do not, as well as those of their classmates who come from various cultures around the world. The implicit curriculum of today's typical religious studies course is centered around the idea of increasing tolerance of and appreciation for religious diversity. Alongside faculty in area studies, those in religious studies frequently articulate their mission in terms of promoting deeper cross-cultural understanding. All of this, one hopes, produces students who are more knowledgeable, capable, and sympathetic citizens of our shrinking globe. One thing that religious studies departments typically do not attempt to do is to indoctrinate their students, to guide them towards some particular set of religious ideas that the faculty believes ought to be accepted and understood as true. Within the religious studies approach, religious ideas are identified as potential objects of belief only insofar as they are understood to constitute what religious people out there in the world take to be true. Students are encouraged to bracket their own religious beliefs, at least for a semester, for the sake of gaining a deeper understanding of unfamiliar religious perspectives. And while bracketing is undoubtedly an important skill that students in religious studies courses do need to learn, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that belief in the truth or falsity of a particular set of religious ideas is not an ancillary aspect of religious identity for today's typical religious adherent. Why and how this has come to be the case is an important and fascinating historical topic that I will not touch on here. Today's so-called believer may be interested in the religious ideas of other traditions for the sake of tolerance and appreciation, but this interest is typically rooted in, if not eclipsed by, a more fundamental commitment to the ideas of their own traditions as truthful expressions of the way the world really is. Moreover, this is arguably the case not only for the religious fundamentalist and conservative, but for the religious moderate and liberal as well. Although admittedly with perhaps wildly different notions of truthfulness, all the way from accurate literal reference to adequate metaphorical signification, religious fundamentalists, conservatives, moderates, liberals, all intentionally and in most cases vigorously perpetuate and promote their own traditions because of something they all share, an understanding of their own tradition as saying something true and worthwhile about reality. In the case of the fundamentalist, of course, absolutely and universally so. In the case of the moderate or liberal, more likely in some limited way that may or may not be perceived as applicable to others. So religious studies thus finds itself in the somewhat awkward position, at least I feel awkward in this position, of insisting that its teachers and students practice intellectual abstinence with respect to religious belief, something that those teaching in the field acknowledge as fundamental to the nature of the subject, at least in today's world. From a practical and political perspective, this compromise, I think, has in fact been vitally important in the struggle against the long and rather ugly history of Westerners imposing their religious beliefs, often violently, on others. But as a principled constraint upon the scholarly study and teaching of religion, it seems to me at least obviously problematic. What other academic field tells its students that the actual truth of the ideas to be considered is off limits? That truth is complicated? Yes. That getting at the truth is difficult? Of course. That understanding someone's point of view and why they espouse it is as important as understanding whether they're right? Indeed. And that students should refrain from judging an unfamiliar situation until they have a solid grasp of what's going on from the perspective of the insider? Absolutely. But what other field of study introduces its subject matter to students by telling them that they will be expected to exclude the question of the truth of the basic ideas around which this field is organized for the sake of broader appreciation? How is such a compromise not a fundamental abdication of scholarly and pedagogical responsibility, notwithstanding all the good reasons that motivate it? How, in the end, does this compromise not trivialize the very subject it claims to value? Now, perhaps there is no way out of this difficulty. Perhaps. The conventional wisdom regarding the unavoidability and relative stability of the compromise would seem to indicate, at the very least, that there is no easy solution. The challenge, as I see it then, is to provide a viable alternative that, on the one hand, lives as comfortably as the compromise within the confines of a multi-religious secularity, and on the other hand, retains the hard-won value, characteristic of secular higher education, of seeking truth without political or religious interference. Now, of course, the traditional theological approach is still an option, for those whose primary audience is like-mindedly or even other-mindedly religious, but it is not viable for those of us working and studying at secular institutions. For us, the traditional theological approach, even in its more ecumenical forms, is too dependent on a shared religious sensibility that is no longer a part of the culture of secular higher education. Note that I am not defending or presuming the superiority of the secular approach over and against the theological approach, the traditional theological approach. I'm only speaking as someone who, although trained primarily according to a liberal version of the latter, now writes and teaches within the context of the former, and thus as someone who is presently concerned with the fact that the secular approach operates with an intellectually unsatisfying norm as one of its core principles, namely that scholarship and teaching about religion must forever defer the basic and very natural question of the truth of the religious ideas we study. Naturalism in science and the academy. One potentially fruitful lens for bringing this issue into clearer focus is, I think, the category of naturalism, as it is commonly used in discussions of the nature, purview, and practice of science. As there are many different ways of understanding the term naturalism, I will stipulate the following definition. Naturalism, as I use the term in this paper, is the view that supernatural or otherworldly agencies or forces ought to play no role in scientific theories or explanations, because they are immune, whether in principle or in practice, to the continuity of overlapping methods and tools that characterizes the various scientific disciplines and spans the scale of entities in our world from smallest to largest and simplest to most complex. Now, although problematic for any number of reasons, which I will omit, I stipulate this definition because I think it follows pretty closely mainstream usage. And in the context of the argument I'm developing here today, it's not necessary for us to agree about what exactly counts as natural or supernatural, this worldly or otherworldly. What is important for my purposes is that the term functions to exclude certain types of alleged agencies and forces from consideration. From a naturalistic perspective, then, agencies and forces that are not amenable to the methods and tools of scientific investigation are to be regarded as off limits for scientific explanation. Now, those who argue over whether naturalism is or is not an essential element of scientific progress typically debate the relative merits of two main variants, so-called ontological or metaphysical naturalism on the one hand, and methodological naturalism on the other. Building upon the definition of naturalism I just stipulated, ontological naturalism is the view that supernatural or otherworldly agencies or forces ought to play no role in scientific theories or explanations simply because they are understood not to exist outside the realm of the human imagination. Methodological naturalism is the subtly distinct view that making progress in science depends only on scientists seeing the world as if there were no supernatural or otherworldly agencies or forces at work within it. This latter version does not require scientists to personally assert or assent to the truth of ontological naturalism, only that they set aside any thought of supernatural or otherworldly interference when they work qua scientists. The ontological variant thus regards naturalism as following from the nature of reality itself, whereas the methodological variant merely advocates naturalism as a practically useful perspective to be adopted when doing science. Now, I have to admit to having become increasingly disillusioned with both of these varieties of naturalism. In the case of ontological naturalism, it seems to me that insisting upon a certain view of reality, of what reality comprises, is tendentious and premature given the widespread disagreements that persist over the nature of reality even into our own age. On the other hand, the second variant strikes me as constrictive and uninspiring, especially in light of the need for scientists to be open to cognizing the world in ways that go far beyond what our evolutionarily honed intuitions regarding what is or is not possible, what does or does not exist. In their place, I would therefore like to propose an alternative, a variant of naturalism I refer to as epistemic naturalism. By using the term epistemic, I mean to signal the importance of how any claim to knowledge is arrived at, as opposed to how reality is constituted or how it is taken to be constituted, the as-if approach, for the purpose of some particular style or mode of investigation. On the basis of epistemic naturalism, students would be free to construe the nature of reality however they prefer. They would also be free to consider whatever methods of investigation they wish, no matter how unorthodox. And the only thing that they would not be free to do in a religious studies class operating under the mantle of epistemic naturalism would be to insist upon the correctness of some particular construal of reality or method of investigation on the basis of self-authorizing revelation. In other words, a student could not argue for a claim on the basis of its having been obtained in some way other than those rooted in and enabled by our humanly shared channels of perception and cognition. To put the point positively, students would be entirely free to assert or investigate as a candidate for knowledge any claim, as long as they understand themselves to be asserting or investigating that claim through the use of their own personal faculties rather than in spite of them. And by extension, even a claim asserted by someone else outside the context of the religious studies classroom on the basis of self-authorizing revelation, for example, someone who understands themselves to have received the claim directly or indirectly through a series of events beginning with a supernatural act of revelation, even that kind of claim is fair game for the religious studies classroom, as long as the claim's original revelation-based justification is set aside. Now, this would include claims regarding the nature of God, the ultimate, the origin of natural and social order, the nature of the human condition, the significance of suffering and natural evil, the basis for and characteristics of moral action, and the goals and methods of achieving salvation or liberation. I draw those categories, the ones I just listed, from a standard religious studies textbook for undergraduates by David Livingston, Anatomy of the Sacred. Now, here I want to pause a moment to address an apparent problem that might have occurred to you, some of you in the audience, in the form of a counterexample. Perhaps you are thinking, well, what about claims made by aliens? Shouldn't they count as knowledge candidates even if they don't have our channels of perception and cognition? Or what about claims made by someone tripping on LSD? Notwithstanding the similar channels of perception and cognition, we wouldn't want to count those as knowledge candidates, would we? Or what about a computer that claims to gain knowledge about the world through the use of its own expertly programmed personal faculties? Would we want to regard it as capable of having knowledge despite the tenuous nature of its personhood? And finally, what about the dog that barks incessantly until I come over and discover that Timmy has in fact fallen down the well? Doesn't the dog know, in some appropriate canine sense of the word, why it is barking? In short, doesn't the anthropocentric nature of my concept of epistemic naturalism require us to accept things we wouldn't otherwise want to count as knowledge candidates, on the one hand, and force us to reject things that we would otherwise want to include, on the other? Well, gentle listener, this is a sharp-eyed question, and I suspect we could spend quite a long time sorting through the examples I have given, as well as others you could dream up, and this would be great fun, I'm sure. but it would distract us from the way in which I want to use this term, epistemic naturalism. My goal here is not to develop a logically airtight definition that is at once adequate to all cases and applicable in each, but rather to come up with a definition that does the work I need it to in my particular context, namely that of teaching religious studies within the secular academy. If you will allow me then, I would like to set aside this interesting question and instead pursue one I hope might have occurred to you as well, namely, what benefits does epistemic naturalism offer the possibility of taking a theological approach to religious ideas in the secular classroom? Well, I'm so glad you asked. The first benefit I will mention is that epistemic naturalism seems to me to work well as a minimum requirement for secular teaching. In both the sciences and the humanities, the presumption that one cannot authorize ideas by claiming for them the status of revelation is so obvious that it doesn't even bear mentioning in most disciplinary contexts. It is simply understood, if not explicitly articulated, to be the proper starting point for any discussion about what is true. To insist upon the status of self-authorizing revelation for one's own claims in a secular classroom is an unacceptable form of special pleading. A supernatural exception is sought to the otherwise general rule of relying on human cognition and perception. The second benefit I see may come as more of a surprise. In fact, I think epistemic naturalism also works as a maximal requirement for secular scholarship and teaching. What more does the secular classroom really need, I think, than mutual agreement never to preempt continued discussion or argument by appealing to some special channel of knowledge available only to me and my tradition? This, I think, should be enough for academic discussion to proceed in any discipline. But now, wait a moment. While a ban on revelation might be sufficient for discussion and debate in the humanities, surely the sciences require more. In particular, wouldn't they also require mutual commitment to the experimental method? While such commitment is indeed central to many, if not all, of the scientific disciplines, I think a commitment to rational argument will inevitably lead to the experimental method in situations where science has managed to gain some epistemic and empirical traction. Those situations are simply the ones where we have found that the world pushes back hard enough against our ideas to allow us to discern better from worse on an empirical basis. And so, yes, I do think that committing to unconstrained rational argument is not only the minimum requirement for secular scholarship and teaching in both the humanities and the sciences, but the maximum requirement for both as well. Note that I do not intend to propose here a universal standard of rationality, according to which all of our attempts at reasoning must be judged. I do not, in other words, mean to deny the cultural specificity of human rationality, including religious and theological rationality. Accepting that human rationality is not univocal, but multivocal, does not by itself keep us from having meaningful or prevent us from having meaningful arguments in a secular context about what it means to be rational. It only makes those arguments more challenging. There is room, I think, within epistemic naturalism for substantial disagreement, including cultural and religious disagreement regarding what it means to be rational. The only limitation required by epistemic naturalism is that self-authorizing revelation cannot be regarded as a valid epistemic warrant. Now, this may not be sufficient for academic work and debate to proceed in religious contexts, but I do think it is sufficient for such work and debate to proceed in secular contexts, which, as I've stated, is my present concern. Now, there is a remaining question, namely, whether appeals to revelation can be excised from larger systems of religious belief without either failing to register what those systems of belief hold most dear, or, on the other hand, destroying their coherence. As to the first possibility, failing to register what they hold most dear, this would be a serious problem if the goal were to register what religious traditions say completely and authentically on their own terms. But that's not the central goal of my proposal. Instead, I see the goal of theological engagement with religious ideas in a secular context being that of creating space for students to consider for themselves the value and truth of the ideas originating within the world's religions. As to the second possibility, that one simply destroys the coherence of the belief system, this does not appear to me to be an all or nothing affair. Some coherence may be lost, but it seems to me that many of the ideas will very likely continue to be perceived as viable and persuasive. Now, the third benefit of epistemic naturalism, and this is arguably the most important for taking a theological approach to religious ideas in the secular classroom, is that it makes the personal consideration of religious ideas as truth candidates possible in the context of a secular religious studies classroom. The ideas will, of course, need to be understood by students in a particular way that is compatible with epistemic naturalism, and that's the subject of the next section of this paper. But first, notice that epistemic naturalism does its work by eliminating, and on its own terms, of course, any fundamental distinction between religious and non-religious claims about the nature of reality or the human person, as well as any correspondingly fundamental distinction between religious and non-religious philosophers, lovers of wisdom. There are only the claims we make, all of them the product of human thought, and all of them perceived by any given audience as more or less plausible, to be analyzed and evaluated as possible truths, and only students and a teacher as guide wanting to explore possible answers. Separating religious ideas from their self-authorizing revelatory warrants, which admittedly may not be equally viable for all religious traditions, opens the door nonetheless to a secular form of theological consideration of truth claims made by the world's religious traditions regarding the nature of reality and the human person. Now, of course, some claims will need to be rejected straight away. For example, the claim that humans originate historically and biologically from a single, original, morphologically modern human couple. Our understanding of the evolutionary connectedness and origin of all life on Earth rules out this particular claim. Similarly, any claim that contradicts what we have discovered and now take ourselves to know from scientific and historical investigation cannot continue to enjoy the status of truth candidate. However, I trust it will not seem implausible when I say that the situation for many of the more powerful and existential claims made by the world's religious traditions is decidedly less clear. For example, the age-old debate over whether reality is fundamentally loving, indifferent, physical, spiritual, empty. This debate is not in any straightforward way contradicted by what humanity has been so far able to discover about reality through scientific and historical investigation. The apparent intractability of this debate merely exposes, I think, the limits of our current scientific toolkit, which is to say, the limits of our current ability to figure out how to get the world to push back against our different views of the ultimate nature of reality. And if, for the purposes of theological engagement with religious ideas in the secular context of the religious studies classroom, if I am proposing that we not allow any of the ideas associated with the world's religious traditions to claim for themselves the status of revelation, How then do I propose to treat them? In the next section, I will explain why I think it is helpful to regard them as hypotheses. Hypotheses having to do primarily with human meaning, purpose, and morality. Varieties of hypotheses. Through its efforts at scientific investigation, humanity has honed its skill at knowing which hypotheses are likely to be sufficiently tractable. Those, in other words, against which the world and our own behaviors are likely to push back with enough consistency and force to consider them deserving of the title knowledge. However feeble or fallible such efforts in this regard might appear to be in retrospect. This is exactly what empirically testable means. Figuring out how to get the world to push back against our hypotheses about what is true. Reality has proven to be much more empirically testable in some respects than others. And scientists have a strong track record of continually finding novel ways of getting the world to push back against our hypotheses. Although science neither transcends the interpretive intricacies of human understanding, nor stands fully outside the particularity of cultural convention, it nonetheless successfully drives the expansion of knowledge because it has proven itself adept at figuring out how to get the world to push back. Epistemic naturalism has no problem endorsing this perspective, I think, on what humans have achieved through science. But what have we achieved through religion? From the perspective of epistemic naturalism, I want to understand religion as the realm in which humanity attempts to construct conceptual frameworks that enable us to develop hypotheses, specific hypotheses regarding the meaning, purpose, and morality of our own existence. The basic difference between science and religion from this perspective is that in the latter case, we have not yet figured out how to get the world to push back in any decisive way against our hypotheses. Unlike in the case of science, we have not figured out how to get the world to push back with enough consistency and force for us to make confident empirical determinations on religious matters. And perhaps we never will. But regardless of whether we eventually succeed, we cannot, I think, in the meantime, cease to ponder our humanity or rely upon frameworks that supply us with ideas related to meaning, purpose, and morality. The search for such ideas, and indeed our need to rely upon them, are integral to who we are as a species, and we cannot unask the questions they engender. Religion, from the perspective of epistemic naturalism, has to do then primarily with the realm of human inquiry and action, where we pursue answers because we need to live our lives under some particular framework of meaning, but where the feedback has been, and is, for the moment at least, insufficient in most cases for us to clearly distinguish true from false. Now, adopting this view of science and religion leads to a view of human beings as thoroughgoing hypothesizers. From the perspective of epistemic naturalism, when we figure out ways to test our hypotheses, we then tend to call the resulting knowledge scientific. Our hypotheses about meaning, purpose, morality have thus far seemed rather impervious to such efforts, and so are frequently embraced or rejected as religious. In either case, though, we develop hypotheses about the way the world is and then attempt to live our lives accordingly. We inhabit the more consequential and fundamental of these hypotheses, as I think young animals inhabit their nests. We leverage them as places of felt order and safety from which to venture out and attempt further exploration and understanding. In the scientific arena, those hypotheses that survive testing become the basis for new areas of exploration. In the religious arena, our hypotheses form sacred canopies, to borrow sociologist Peter Berger's famous phrase, sacred canopies that shield us from the ever-threatening chaos and randomness of existence. In both arenas, we test our hypotheses to the degree that we know how. Some turn out to be easily testable and others do not. And we stick with those that turn out to be useful in the broadest sense of that term, and abandon or ignore those that don't. Whether we should mourn or celebrate the fact that not all hypotheses appear to be amenable to empirical testing depends on one's perspective, but when construed according to the framework I am proposing here, both kinds of hypotheses can be understood as playing legitimate, indeed crucial roles in our attempts to lead lives filled with meaning, purpose, and morality. Now, I should point out that I am not arguing against the idea that in certain ways religious people are able to test their ideas. Such tests, however, I think are typically experiential in character rather than robustly experimental. And experiential tests probe, I think, primarily the personal value of hypotheses rather than their truth. When someone finds that a new religious idea, and on the present account, a new hypothesis, provides them with deeper meaning, motivates their actions more decisively, or sustains their hopes more emphatically, that idea can be enormously valuable to the individual and their community. And each of these felt benefits is indeed a kind of pushback from the world about the idea's value. But the fact that the same kind of benefits accrue to people with vastly different and even conflicting religious ideas, backgrounds, and worldviews negates any putative epistemic value of such tests. And although some will find this a difficult pill to swallow, from the perspective of epistemic naturalism, the experiential confirmation of religious ideas' personal value is simply not a reliable epistemic indicator of their truth, no matter how important or valuable such confirmation may be to the individual or their community. So, having laid out the basic orientation of my proposal to treat religious ideas as hypotheses in a secular academic context, in the final section of my paper, I would briefly like to consider two specific issues it raises with regard to the possibility of theological study in a secular undergraduate setting. Theological engagement with religious ideas in the secular undergraduate classroom. The first issue to tackle here is the question of which ideas to have students engage from which traditions. The pedagogical approach would undoubtedly need to be comparative so that students could be exposed to at least a representative portion of the breadth of religious ideas present across the globe and human history. Others have developed ways of engaging in comparative theological analysis, some of which are more philosophical and others of which are more ecumenically and faith-oriented. More philosophical approaches to comparative theology might be well suited to the secular undergraduate classroom, but those with strong commitments to defending the actuality and historicity of revelation would need to be dissected under the lens of epistemic naturalism. And much ecumenical theological dialogue happens from the perspective of active practitioners from multiple religious traditions engaging one another. And again, any presumption of revelation would need to be highlighted and, so to speak, factored out so that the ideas were as congruent as possible with the norm of epistemic naturalism. This type of theologizing might be particularly interesting for students to consider as a ready source of contrasting ideas. In either case, though, the success of a secular undergraduate course that asks students to engage religious ideas theologically would clearly require a strong pedagogical hand on the part of the instructor. There are no models I know of for teaching religious ideas in this way, and students would need thorough explanation of the basic principles underlying the course and would need to be introduced to the approach with numerous examples before they were asked to contribute their own ideas. I haven't gone the extra step of providing copious examples in this paper, and I recognize that you might feel a bit cheated as a result, but today I wanted to focus on the broader principles of my proposal. That said, the viability of my proposal does depend crucially on the choice of which theologians and which traditions one asks students to engage. This task lies ahead of me, I know, and for now I can only ask you to stay tuned. The second important issue is the question of educational value. What might undergraduates studying in a secular academic context expect to gain from engaging theologically with religious ideas? 4 different benefits come to mind as goals to aim for. First, engaging with theologians' ideas would help deepen students' awareness and understanding of various religious perspectives prevalent in cultures across the globe. Second, thinking carefully about the ways in which religious ideas can and cannot be tested, and what kind of tests might be relevant, and whether testing is even conceivable, would push students to think about the benefits and limits of empirical investigation, and would reinforce the point that not all things we judge to be important about life, whether we consider ourselves to be religious or secular, not all things are amenable to experimental analysis. It would also raise the important question of whether uncovering new ways of testing the truth of religious claims regarding the meaning, purpose, and morality of human life in the future is actually a reasonable goal to aim for. Third, engaging theological writing would expose students to a level of rigor in religious thinking that exceeds what most undergraduates associate with religious discourse. It would invite them to consider a more sophisticated form of religious thought than the catechesis they were exposed to or perhaps heard about as children, introducing them to unfamiliar and intellectually robust ways of thinking religiously about meaning, purpose, and morality. And finally, engaging contemporary religious ideas theologically would expose students in a secular context to critiques of the materialist, consumerist orthodoxy that many of them, at least many of my students, bring, often unconsciously, into the classroom. Now, within each of these benefits or goals of a course in religious studies that asks students to think theologically about religious ideas, the focus would not be on deciding what counts as a true or authentic exposition of a particular religious tradition. Is this authentic Buddhism? Is that true Christian doctrine? But rather on coming to a judgment about which ideas are, in and of themselves, most compelling and likely to be true. What kinds of evidence might count for or against them, and whether testability is or might someday be conceivable. In the end, the value of engaging religious ideas theologically in a secular context would depend upon students' own existential investment in the issues themselves, whether from an anthropological, ecological, economic, cosmological angle, or something else. So when taken as hypotheses, the ideas and their value would need to be examined, tested, and judged in light of what today's students bring to the table in the way of understanding themselves and the world in which they live. Now, there is much more that needs to be said to explain and justify this overall proposal, but I hope that in the brief time that I've spent today telling you about it, I've managed to convince you that at least there's a program here worthy of further consideration. I'm very much looking forward to the comments and critiques of those who graciously agreed to respond to my paper. And I'm especially excited about getting these ideas in front of my own students to see how my own sense of what might be possible in the way of theological engagement with religious ideas in a secular context, what resonates with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirk. Excellent presentation. So before we go to the responses, I'll just say, if you want to raise questions for the Q&A at the end, the simplest way would be to put it into the chat or the Q&A. So just write them down and we'll process those in a little while. Today's first respondent is Dr. Hongjo Lee. Dr. Lee holds a PhD in theoretical physics, specializing in early universe cosmology, and an MDiv. Hongjo is currently a fifth-year doctoral student studying with me for his second PhD. He'll be one of the few in our world that has these two. This time in theology and science, focusing on creation and eschatology in light of cosmology. Hongjo, floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob. Do you hear me? Okay, first, I'd like to thank Bob and the CTNS for allowing me to be a participant at this historic moment. A few hours ago, I got a message from my younger brother. I'd like to share my personal story. In Korea, that his wife gave birth to a super baby this morning with 9 pounds, which made me so happy. And I think all of us here should be happy this afternoon for the birth of a new Russell Fellow with a huge ambition, even more than 9 pounds, to engage theological text in a secular academic setting. Kirk, thank you for your inspiring talk with great ambition. It sounds so appealing to me, perhaps because it came from your own Jichim Leben, from your own setting in life. And I'm also grateful for the opportunity to give a small response to your great presentation. I'd like to begin with your critique of religious studies in that it tells its students that the actual truth of the ideas to be considered is off limit. I agree with you that we should not exclude the question of the truth of the basic ideas around which it is organized for the sake of broader appreciation. However, at the same time, I think we should ask first if it really does exclude the question of the truth and why it looks so. I think it might be controversial if it really does exclude the question of the truth. Nevertheless, it is certainly true to me that it looks so apparently. Then the next question should be why? It may sound ironical, but it seems to me, at least, that this apparent defect suggests a way for the non-confessional theological study of religious ideas than you proposed to be on the table of a secular context. I think the difficulty we face in putting the theological study of religious ideas in a secular academic context comes from the lack of off-limit. Off-limit is not a mere defect, but a necessity for a study to be in a secular academic context because it makes its claims hypothetical, which you desire. Science also has off-limit, I would argue. For example, it is not legitimate for scientists to ask the question if the laws of physics are really based on mathematical equations. In some sense, it might seem to exclude the question of the truth, but this off-limit allows us distinguish pseudoscience from science. I remember that I once heard someone in the creation science camp arguing that our universe abruptly unfolded itself, that even if it might look old to us, it is indeed very young. I didn't dare to ask this question, but I had this question in my brain at the moment. My question was, just in my brain, what is the mathematical equation that describes your universe? To me, he was ignoring the off-limit posited by science that makes it as science. And I believe that setting some proper off-limit for the theological study of religious ideas is required to make it work as hypothetical theories. Again, with this off-limit, we might need to sacrifice a lot of truths we have existentially. We all know that the truth we have is much more than it can be said. Since the academic study cannot fathom religious ideas as a whole, we should set a proper boundary to make it fathomable in the secular context. Our homework is to widen the fathomable area as much as possible by formulating theology to be able to interact with our contemporary context. I believe this is our common goal that we share and one you're aimed throughout your presentation. Let me move on to the epistemic naturalism you proposed. First, let me say that I like the distinction you made between the ontological naturalism and the methodological naturalism. I think with the former, which is ontological naturalism, it is almost impossible to open space for any theological study of religious ideas, regardless of whether it is confessional or even non-confessional, as you suggested. I believe that that's why most scholars in the field of theology and science adopt only the latter, and that it should be a starting point for what you suggested as well. I'd like to hear more about how it struck you as constrictive and uninspiring, because it is rather the opposite to me. Maybe I misunderstood you, but in this context, it was quite difficult for me to understand why you ruled out methodological naturalism for epistemic naturalism. You emphasize the importance of how a candidate for knowledge is arrived at, as opposed to how reality is constituted. However, can you really think about the knowledge separated from the reality? Isn't the theological study of religious ideas to reveal the true reality? Imagine we argue that the universe is full of love because God of love created it. Let's suppose that. How could we justify this argument, setting aside the original revelation-based justification? Perhaps the reason why you brought epistemic naturalism is that you are concerned about the situation that one insists upon the correctness of their claim on the basis of revelation. I understand your concern. However, would it be a best candidate to wipe out that concern? The reason why scholars in the field of theology and science adopted methodological naturalism was, as far as I understand, to argue that theology could be considered legitimate field even in the secular context, which resonates with your huge aim. On the other hand, even if epistemic naturalism might allow us to construe the nature of reality however one prefers, as you claimed, I'm doubtful that it would also view theological study of religious ideas as compelling. I would concern that it might just support scientific imperialism and rather weakens all the claims we make through the theological study. It will never deny the legitimacy of theological study for sure, but it might separate it from other studies, say science. Then epistemic naturalism could be reduced to ontological naturalism, which I know you would never be happy with. Even though it might look as if it widens the way to the truth, I think it could even narrow the way. For this reason, although I agree with you that the study you suggested should share channels of perception and cognition, I wonder if epistemic naturalism that sets aside the revelation, or in a broader sense, transcendent, could be a best candidate to make theological study empowered in the secular context. What I suggest as another alternative can be described this way very roughly. Take some key statements from Revelation and keep them as assumptions, not as absolute truth claims. Then, with those assumptions, we could make hypothetical theories. It would be different in content from other secular studies, but methodologically similar to what other secular studies do. Since with those assumptions, we build hypothetical theories within a secular context. Again, I believe the real issue is how to present them to the secular academy, not to eliminate or hide them. Being all this said, I try to put myself in your shoes, assuming that you might still like to work with epistemic naturalism because you emphasize that a lot. In that case, I would suggest drawing two different regions, categorically different from each other. In one region, put everything you suggested in the secular context, following the spirit of epistemic naturalism. And in the other region, put something beyond them. Then graft the latter upon the former. The latter becomes a source for the former. The former consists of hypotheses at the level of other hypotheses in the secular context, and thus can be compared to them. But we should not forget that they are empowered by their source in the other region, which could be called assumptions in the secular context. This is not ontological naturalism for sure, but this may be understood as a variant of methodological naturalism. Now, one can ask this question, but wouldn't it look inferior to other studies, say science, that do not rely on the other region than the secular region of or materialism? My answer is not necessarily. It's not necessarily, unless we fall into ontological naturalism. Now, we should decide what kind of truth claims to put in the region of epistemic region. It should not be like a physical history of the universe described by Big Bang cosmology. Science alone does that job perfectly. It would be a nonsense to seek another physical cosmology from this new study that contradicts what we already know from scientific and historical investigation, as you already pointed out very well. Then, what should we put there? I think these should be filled with theological statements that could generate philosophical concepts. Then, they could interact with theological statements that could generate philosophical concepts as well. Theological statements and scientific statements should definitely be distinguished from each other. However, what they generate could be brought on the same table in the secular context and discussed in the same setting, as long as they are formulated in a hypothetical way. I believe this is what we share and aim together in common. I know what I said is far from thorough. I didn't have enough time to prepare for this, but I hope modestly that it would initiate our further discussion and our further friendship. I would love to continue to learn from you through our continual fellowship. Thank you.
Thank you, Hongju. That was great. Kirk, want to take a couple minutes to respond?
Sure. So, Hyungju, I'm very insightful and sharp. So thank you. You undersell your ability to prepare quickly. So when you first started talking, I thought that we were headed for significant disagreement. As you kept talking, I wondered if we ultimately do disagree. And my word, hypothesis, seems to me got replaced by your word, assumption, but they seem to be doing sort of the same work. I'm not saying to throw away ideas of transcendence or God. The only thing I'm saying is that any idea brought to the secular table, so to speak, needs to be regarded as a hypothesis and cannot be warranted and put on the table as a piece of knowledge that comes from a special place that no one else has access to. That's the only thing that I think I need to resist or put off limits, as you put it. But I think I want, now let's see, how did you say it? Theology argues about true reality. And this is why I think methodological naturalism is problematic and uninspiring, because I guess it doesn't have to be practiced this way, but at least as it's commonly understood, it's a kind of bracketing of the possible existence of transcendence. And that's exactly what you don't want, what Bob doesn't want, and what I don't want. And we'll hear from Mary eventually. I don't want that. And I'm not saying that claims about transcendence should be bracketed. It's only their warrant in Revelation that should be bracketed. So as long as the claims are put on the table as hypothetical, then I think, and if hypothesis is the best word, or assumption, I'm not sure. I think hypothesis, I kind of like that word, so I've been trying it on. But I think perhaps in the end we're aiming for that you get me, and that you are in fact advocating something that's pretty close to what I was trying to advocate, but maybe didn't articulate in ways that always pleased you or made sense to you. So I thank you for your comments, and it's always very helpful to experience how people experience your work, right? What people hear in it, because they hear different things than you do. So I'll need to reflect on that more, and yes, I look forward to further conversation as well.
Thank you, Kirk. Great. So our second respondent is Dr. Marion J.R. Gilton. Dr. Gilton is assistant professor in the history and philosophy of science at the University of Pittsburgh. Her primary research interests are in the history and philosophy of physics. She is interested in the mathematical and conceptual foundations of contemporary particle physics, the relationship between classical and quantum field theories, the history of quantum mechanics, and the history of mathematical, metaphysical, and other conceptual precursors to the scientific revolution. Her secondary research interests include philosophical logic, especially as applied to moral reasoning. Marianne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you so much to the Center for having me today. It's really a pleasure to be here. And Kirk, thank you for the wonderful lecture. This has been really fun to think about and ponder over. What I have today is two kind of broad overall comments about the project, followed by a couple of thoughts about epistemic naturalism, and then a few more about some of the ending notes of the relationship between science and theology on this view, and some maybe surprising and fun parallels between the two. So at the general level, the first thing I want to say is that I find the motivation really compelling. It strikes me that you've put your finger on a way in which, maybe not everywhere standard, but a standard approach to secular religious studies by employing this norm of bracketing at the foundational level. It comes at this great cost. And it's the cost of sort of not allowing oneself to engage in issues of the real truth of these questions. I think it's really valuable the way you point out how this is like the question of the truth is not only a natural question to ask that we're just sort of put aside, but that making space to actually ask those or investigate those truth questions opens up this expansive landscape for intellectual endeavors. And without that, there's a sort of, it strikes me, an impoverished way of going about religious studies. And so saying that, I think there may be a few ways you can make this case even stronger. There's more grist for your mill here. So you say that the one of the benefits, the value, the payoff at the end of engaging with religious ideas theologically in the secular context would depend upon students' existential investment in the issues. Sort of, we'll have to wait and see what the students actually bring. But I think, moreover, what you're in a position to say is that on your approach, you have the capacity to leverage that existential investment, however much in fact there is amongst your students, in a way that the bracketing approach by definition simply cannot access. Similarly, you speak about the value of exposing them to this more sophisticated, more robust way of thinking. And I think that that's certainly valuable. And beyond that too, there strikes me to be this potential to ask students to go beyond exposure, perhaps not in an introductory course, more in advanced courses, to do more of the hard intellectual work for themselves and reckon with the ideas, to go beyond exposure. My second general comment is that it strikes me that this approach has many potential parallels with ways of teaching philosophy that are fairly standard, right? In a introductory philosophy class, we might ask students to ponder the relative merits of an Aristotelian conception of being versus a Platonic conception of being. And there's no expectation that students will have sort of settled this age-old debate by the end of the semester, but they're asked to seriously reckon with these ideas, to try and get their own thinking in each of these frameworks and try it out. And that seems to kind of fit with what you're saying here, that they're not asked to sort of study sociologically where Platonism came from, where Aristotelianism came from, and the sort of situation it has within larger social context or something like this. So that's kind of a broad suggestion of there being this potential affinity with how philosophy is already done, that there might be a lot to sort of borrow from. And it struck me as you spoke today, maybe more specifically, that there's potentially a strong affinity with philosophy of physics here. So, right, you put it rhetorically, what other discipline asks students to constantly bracket the truth of these claims? Well, sometimes physics does this, right? Sometimes physics, the physics culture says, shut up and calculate. Don't ask what quantum mechanics means. That's not what it's for. It works. Do your homework and do it well, right? And if you're unsatisfied with that, you maybe find out that philosophy of physics exists, and that's where you get to go ask these questions. Okay. So next, I want to turn to epistemic naturalism, as you've put it forward here. I have just sort of a question for, hopefully for clarifying what it is and what's at stake in it. So, right, I take it that it's this ban on revelation, but there seems to be potentially two different things that ban is really about, right? Maybe it's a ban on revelation on the principle of the democratization of academic discourse, right? We need to appeal to shared human faculties, and insofar as revelation is special, it's not shared, then that's why it should be banned. On the other hand, it sounds like perhaps the reason is a little bit different, that it's instead revelation by definition is a means of establishing a claim in the absence of rational argument. And it's that absence of rational argument that's the problem. And so I'd just be curious to hear if both of those are equally important motivations for it, or if one is more important than the other. It also struck me that I think epistemic naturalism maybe isn't enough. It isn't maximal for getting academic discussion to proceed, or at least not enough for it to proceed well. So if we kind of take the emphasis on unconstrained rational argument way of understanding epistemic naturalism, but we've got rational argument in the hands of humans that need more constraint on how to actually wield this well and in productive sort of social contexts. And so what comes to my mind is the work on virtue epistemology, that there are epistemic virtues required, things like curiosity, diligence, epistemic humility, so on and so forth, that might I think plausibly constitute additional norms that we would want to bring in order to get academic discourse going productively, in addition to epistemic naturalism. All right, mindful of the time here. I've got one sort of worry or puzzle over epistemic naturalism, which is, I wonder if it's conceptually possible, and then if it really is possible, if that's acceptable to you, that it could become self-exhausting. Right, so it's an approach for investigating religious ideas, but of course, revelation is such a religious idea, and so I'm curious how it is that the epistemic naturalist would go about investigating the religious idea that knowledge could be gained through revelation. And if we have a way forward under epistemic naturalism to do that investigation, what happens if that investigation turns out to be positive? Do you have to then reject epistemic naturalism in the end? All right, and then briefly, just a couple thoughts on the parallels with science. The idea of hypotheses that can be tested, I think, is, in your approach, usefully very broad. And one place where you might look for sort of, I think maybe, again, more grist for your mill here, is in the case of uses of simulation in science, where you, for whatever reason, don't have access to run in real life the sort of experimental test you'd want to run. So instead we'll run a simulation. And this is of course broadly used from various cases of physics to, I think, in biology as well, and modeling population dynamics or protein folding, right? Simulation's now a pretty standard tool. And so I wonder if, just kind of a suggestion here, if there's interesting parallels to develop there with the kind of tests that you might want to develop in the religious case, where similarly you have trouble getting the kind of real world contact or pushback that you're thinking of. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Marion. Great. Kirk, your turn.
Yeah, so thanks, Miriam. That's a lot of good stuff to chew on. Let's see, back at my notes. I do think I like your language of reckoning with, and I would be very interested in knowing and reading literature, if it's out there, pedagogical literature written by philosophers about how to get students to reckon with ideas that are unfamiliar and difficult and perhaps seemingly odd. You know, why would anyone ever think that? But trying to get themselves into the mindset. So yes, I hadn't thought about going to look if there is pedagogical literature. I can imagine that there is. Why wouldn't there be? And so that could be really helpful. So thanks for pointing that out. I guess I want to, if I may, move to epistemic naturalism. And so you, I think, identified two different sort of ways of understanding the ban on revelation. And if just to make sure I have you right, one of those is it's not a legitimate warrant because we need to limit our appeals to our common human faculties. And then the other is that it's not a legitimate warrant because it doesn't come in the form of a rational argument. It comes in the form of a non or anti or super rational claim that authorizes itself without appeal to argument. I think, so I think both of those are at play. Both of those are certainly in the back of my mind, and both seem like, to me, the right kinds of reasons to say we're going to set aside revelation as an epistemic warrant. So I guess I'm interested in hearing from you. I'd like to put it back in your court and ask you, do you think there are implications for my project that align me more with one or the other, or are there pitfalls with either of them that you're thinking about that I ought to avoid, or just what and what in the back, what's going on in the back of your mind when you think, okay, he's got these two different ways of arguing that. That's interesting. Here's why that caught my eye. I'd be interested to hear more from you there. The notion of virtue epistemology, that epistemic naturalism might not be sufficient. I grant that, and I think I need to, and I don't think it will be that difficult to find out a somewhat more nuanced way to make the point that I want to make. But I do appreciate that. Is it self-exhausting, or I think that was the polite word you used. I think what you're really asking is if it's self-negating. And is it open to being negated, right? Start out with this commitment, and then, well, okay, so we're going to investigate and hypothesize about revelation. And what happens if we decide as a class or as a student that, you know, revelations, it really is there, and a path to knowledge that one that is in addition to the way that we normally know things. So I should have seen that coming, and it's a great question, and I need to think more about that. I think in order to be consistent, I better say yes, that I'm open to that. I also think that I'm not terribly worried about that in my context, because I don't think that that's going to be something that my students will want to pursue. If they do, sure, I'm happy to pursue that with them. And there may be occasionally, I could imagine having a student who is personally religious in my class, who thinks that this is a sort of, who thinks along exactly the lines that you suggested, and wants to know, well, can I study for my paper? Can I write about Revelation? So I do need to think that through carefully, because that could happen, and there needs to be room for that in the proposal. But I recognize that it's a point of instability or potential self-referential conflict if I don't handle that carefully. So thank you for that. Simulation, that's very interesting. I'll have to think about. I had thought about my own, the ideas of teaching theology in a secular classroom being a kind of approximation, sort of like the low energy approximation, the linearized version of general relativity, right? It's not the real thing. It's not the full-blown theory in all its nonlinear glory, right? But it is something. It's a shadow of the theory. It's a version of the theory that works in some limited cases and is appropriate and helpful. And I wonder if that's a helpful analogy for thinking about what I'm asking students to do in the classroom. It's a kind of approximation for the sake of having a conversation at all that has any sort of theological cast to it, right? But we do have, but I think and I would want to make it clear that what we're having here is a kind of approximation to what goes on in theology more commonly, right? Because of what we're doing and because of what we're setting aside. So that's that's a well taken point. And our simulations are always approximations, of course, right? You can't simulate them, whatever it is you're looking at, in perfect detail. So you have to make approximations. Could you say something briefly about the different ways of understanding the ban and the motivation for that?
Yeah, sure. Briefly, one thought was that that the democratizing principle might have a weakness to it if one were to argue that all humans do have access to revelation, like maybe in a kind of new agey way of through meditation, you could access an altered state of consciousness and access revelation, and anyone could take my course and learn how to do this, right?
Right.
Someone could try to push that kind of line, or even more seriously, maybe a Plantinga kind of line, that the knowledge of God can be thought of as perception in a certain way. And so if you take that line as giving you access to the divine, then what precludes receiving information from the divine, and wouldn't that be revelation? So
right,
that's where the worry kind of came from.
I see. Okay. Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. Yeah, the idea of in the draft that I read for today, I inserted in a few places, at least, where I talked about revelation, the idea of self-authorizing revelation, because I do think that there are ways of understanding revelation that would be, I mean, the world reveals itself to us. So it's by itself, it isn't necessarily a problematic term or a term that denotes something beyond what our faculties are capable of. And particularly if you take a planning a kind of approach, then, you know, when we're correctly functioning, we do have this perceptive organ that that puts us in contact and able to know God. So, yeah, none of my students know who Plantinga is, and they would find him very strange and hard to understand. So that might be in an advanced course that we need to consider Plantinga's model. But yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to suggest we take one more pass at the two respondents because our time is pretty good. Hung Jo, do you want to take a minute to respond to Kirk?
Oh, yes. In response to your response to me, I would like to ask you this question. So then how would it be different from critical realism?
So I understand critical realism to be primarily a statement about the way that human language functions. Right? It's an attempt to understand language in a way that allows theology to make claims in a way that's proper to theology, that doesn't necessarily match directly the way that other disciplines use language. So I take it to be a point of view that boils down to a kind of commitment about and a claim about how language functions. And I think that my approach to epistemic naturalism is compatible with it, and I think could be compatible with a variety of understandings of how language works. So I don't take my own approach to be primarily making a linguistic point, but rather an epistemic point. And I don't take critical realism to be primarily an epistemic argument. So I think one is linguistic and one is epistemic, and they can work together and are quite compatible. I think let's imagine the critical realist walks into my class and wants to make a claim on the basis of their critical realism for some kind of revelation that they have received in their critical realist understanding of how humans receive knowledge and how we perceive it and how it's constructed in our heads and how we express it through language. I think I could accept pretty much everything that the critical realist wanted to say about their claim, except for the fact that it originates in some sort of special communication from the divine that is not in principle open to everyone and not in principle reliant on our common human faculties. So I think critical realism can relatively easily countenance claims to revelation. And those are claims that I want to set aside. So, but I don't think they're claims that are central to the critical realist point of view. I don't think revelation is an idea without which critical realism falls. It's not about revelation. It's about language. But, you know, Bob asked a similar question in some of our conversation before today, and he may have different thoughts about it, or may want to characterize critical realism in a different way.
Okay. Marion, do you want to come back?
Yeah, sure. So I'm just trying to do a better job of channeling your own students and not just bring things like planting in that they won't think of. So I'm thinking again of just what seems to be one of the challenges you're wrestling with of getting students to understand what this thing is and buy into it, and that I don't know, it just strikes me that like drawing upon the parallels with science might be this really valuable pedagogical way of getting some buy-in, with the idea of just wrestling with how like the history of science shows the scientific community having to wrestle with major changes and radical ideas and getting into the framework of another way of thinking. So you know, maybe a little crash course on Kuhn from the outset or something to say, look, this happens in science already. We're going to do something similar here, but now focused on these theological ideas. And similarly can use the breadth of the history of theological ideas and across different cultures as well as the sort of initial kind of starting point to say, look, if this has to go on in science, why can't we do it here too?
Right. No, I think that makes a lot of sense, and I can imagine exactly how I'd tell that story about Kuhn and sort of the sweep of the history and philosophy of science in the 20th century and where it started and where it's at now and how it got there. It's a story I love to tell my students anyway, because it messes with their understanding of science. And so sort of an equal opportunity, you know, we're going to presume that science and religion both have something to say, but we're not going to take necessarily what they say at face value. Right. And one can do that with religion, but one can also do that legitimately so and learn a lot from doing that with science. So I like that parallel.
Cool.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Kirk, we don't want to get into critical realism too much, but I think it is primarily a realist theory. It's set against naive realism. It's not primarily an epistemological theory. It's more of an ontological one, I would say. But that's a long conversation for us to have. But
isn't naive realism a claim about how, or an approach, a naive approach, a naive understanding about how language works?
Yes, you're right. They all deal with how language works. But I'm looking at your point about epistemic naturalism, and I'm trying to say that critical realism has a stake in it in terms of its own epistemic claims. Okay. So, but what I really want to say, just really briefly, is how would you deal with the role of imagination or insight or intuition, which plays such a part in physics, for example, in theoretical physics, right? The debate between Bohr and Einstein, or Hoyle and Einstein's followers, over what constitutes a viable understanding of quantum mechanics or of general relativity or cosmology, I should say. I mean, Hoyle's conviction that there couldn't be a beginning to the universe, partly because of his atheism, partly because of his intuition, led him to reformulate or formulate a new theory of gravity, which is not GR exactly, and which allows you to have a universe that expands forever exponentially from no beginning. So he wasn't making a true claim about his atheism, but he was letting his atheism, as one factor, guide him into actually discovering an alternative cosmology, which for approximately 2 decades worked. So I agree with you, and Marianne said it really clearly. I agree with you in a classroom setting, in a secular setting, you have to set aside normative claims about revelation, but I don't think you should be heard as saying people can't be guided by them in their research in the sciences even, let alone in the humanities. Right. So I'd like to use that as a way of sort of tying your work more towards the theology and science community in their sort of general thought about these things. Right. So my argument with Hoyle and Hubble, Hoyle and Einstein is a good example of what I think could help to sort of broaden out your point.
You're talking about path number 8 in your diagram, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's nice to know you have some impact on your students.
Yeah. So, yes, I think that absolutely right about the importance of imagination and not wanting, I certainly would not want to delimit people's sense of what they would be allowed to imagine. And what they would be allowed to presume as an assumption, or as a hypothesis anyway, for the sake of thinking about how the world works, right? Sort of foundational principles. If as a foundational principle, as a hypothesis that, it doesn't make sense to talk about the world as having a beginning, right? That seems to me to be a fair hypothetical starting point for thinking about whether the contingency of the universe, say. So I think it's entirely licit, and I'd want to be explicit about encouraging that, because as you said, I would not want to be heard as denying people the riches of their own imaginations and intuitions for thinking about where they want to start on this quest for how for their own worldview.
Okay. Well, let me just quickly push it one step further, and then we'll go to the audience. Ian Barber obviously makes the claim that there are metaphysical and aesthetic criteria of theory choice in science, right? Not just empirical generalizations, but that's how you arrive at theories. And you're really testing them in terms of those things. So I think it's more than even when I said intuition or imagination. It's actually being guided by the hunch that nature is deterministic, quote, God doesn't play dice, or the hunch for Schrodinger that, following a kind of boring view, that nature, it can't be known directly. You have to know it very indirectly. And all you can say about reality is that it must be such that the quantum mechanical equations work. You can't say what that means. So it seems to me there's a level of aesthetics, right? Metaphysics, even moral values, don't falsify your data, that guide in some fundamental way the enterprise of science. And I'm not sure how that works into your scheme of epistemic naturalism. I'm not sure that your scheme is adequate to that. I think you can enhance it with bringing in that sort of wider domain of how scientists actually work.
Yeah,
but that's a suggestion. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So I think, Braden, are you ready to host those?
Yeah, we've got 4 in the Q&A area, and I'd love to a couple comments that Kirk can choose or not to choose to engage with in the panelist chat, but I'm guessing those will probably take up our time.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at these, and I haven't had a chance to read them, so I need to look at them briefly. Give me just a moment. Mhm. Okay, yeah, lots of several good and deep, challenging questions there. Tim, I want to, well, thank you for coming, by the way. And I want to respond to your question about whether one can falsify claims about value. I'm not thinking particularly in Popperian language. The language of pushback, as you know, is in part from the pragmatist tradition, and language that I picked up from Wesley Wildman when I was at Boston University. So I'm indebted to him for that language. I think it's largely inconceivable to me that we could test value, moral value. I mean, some kinds of value, does the car run? Will it get me to work? Is it a valuable car or not in that sense? There are some kinds of value that I think are relatively open to testing, but particularly moral and metaphysical values, I've not seen any convincing story about how those ideas are testable. I've also not seen any convincing story or argument about how they are in principle not testable. And I want to be open. I think I need to be open to the possibility that someday we will have an epiphany, if I can use that word, and we'll come to some new understanding about how value is built into the world and how we engage it. One of my favorite quotes is from Daniel Dennett in his Consciousness Explained book. He says, he calls it the philosopher's syndrome. And the problem, he says, the syndrome is mistaking a failure of imagination for an insight into necessity. And I take that seriously, even in cases like this, where it seems almost by necessity that values are not empirically testable. But whether or not Dennett would be happy with my use of his aphorism, I do think that it's a failure of imagination. It could be a failure of our imagination at this point to think that value is necessarily beyond empirical analysis. So thanks for that question. I have thought about that some, and that's something of an answer. Another question from Paul Croce. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, Paul. Can a path remain open to the possibility that the sacred is not necessarily beyond nature or reduced to nature, but some expressions of extraordinary qualities within nature? I think that that's entirely possible. And I think it's maybe even likely that students who feel drawn to the idea that there is something extraordinary that goes beyond the ordinary of our world, that many of them will find plausible and attractive the idea that, and the metaphor of depth, rather than height. That the value of our world is in the depths of its being and our ability to engage those depths, rather than the kind of more traditional transcendence metaphor of going beyond or behind or transcending the world to find those values. So I do think extraordinary qualities of nature, what you're talking about there is, I think, a kind of religious naturalism. And though I don't think my own view of epistemic naturalism is wedded to religious naturalism, it certainly would be a viable option within that conversation. And I think having my students read something from the religious naturalist tradition would be helpful and would be appropriate and could spark some interest, I think, among them. Let's see. Joseph Ramelow, sorry again if I'm mispronouncing your name. Critical for theology to remain intersectional with other disciplines, but is there danger in further exposing theology to non-confessional methodology? I don't think I'm really exposing theology to non-confessional methods. I mean, I get what you're saying, but I'm not asking theologians to do anything different than what they do, what they like to do, and on the basis of the presuppositions that they bring to their own work. So I'm trying to make space for theological reflection in a secular context, and that's going to look different than theology that takes faith-seeking understanding as its starting point. But I don't think that I'm not imagining calling for theology as a discipline, right, to embrace a new method, or even to embrace secularity. My project is a big one, but that's even bigger. Yeah, I want to take on the classroom and people who think that theology doesn't have really anything to offer the liberal arts college secular education. That feels like enough of a challenge. And setting it aside, or not to mention the possibility of arguing against or with the world of theologians that they've got it wrong. That's not what I'm trying to do.
Thank you, Kirk. That was really helpful. Great responses. Let me just say real briefly, there's a nice similarity between what you're doing in your context and what Ian Barber did in the context of Carleton College. And he found a way through critical realism to bring theological claims into the table in a secular context without, as you say, access to restrictive revelation. So it warms my heart to see you doing this. Congratulations. I want to thank Braden for hosting, Marion and Hung Jo for their wonderful responses, and mainly Kirk for a great fellowship. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your responses.
Let me say, mark your calendars for our next CNES Public Forum. It's going to be Dr. Hava Samuelson, who's Regent Professor of History and Director of Center for Jewish Studies, Irving and Marion Lowe Professor of Modern Judaism, Arizona State University, and her talk will be on Transhumanism as Contemporary Idolatry, a Jewish Critique. I can hardly wait to hear her. She's great. So please set your sights for 5 p.m. Pacific time, November 17th, Wednesday the 17th. Okay, see you in 2 weeks. And again, thank you all for your day's presentations. Bye-bye.